Hey man, I don't even know what the hell the Waterdogs are doing. Waterdogs lost again, right? In overtime. Why? Because of the X, right? Nardella went 31 for 31. We're talking about the best lacrosse players in the world, and he did not lose a single face-off. You know what that means if you're on the Waterdogs, if you're a Waterdogs coach? That means you should probably get a FOGA. I'm just saying, dog, because you guys could have went 2-0 this weekend, and you messed it up.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. On this episode, we're going to recap all things Week 3 in Premier Lacrosse League action. That audio you heard, if you're listening anywhere you get your podcasts, including Odyssey, Apple, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn as well. Anywhere you get your podcasts on the audio side, that audio you heard to open the show just there was from, I would say, well known in the lacrosse Twitter community. That was Scotty Royster talking about the Philadelphia Waterdogs' need for a face-off man after the display that we saw from them in Week 3 in the PLL, as they were the host team for Week 3 in Philadelphia. So we got to see a double dip of the Waterdogs this past weekend, and again, the performance or lack thereof, I guess you could say in this instance, at the face-off for them. So that was the audio you heard to open the show, and we will dive into that here in this opening segment here in just a second. I'll also be joined later on this episode in segment 2 by Philadelphia Waterdogs beat writer for the PLL, Wyatt Miller. Again, later on in segment 2, but I want to start out the show quickly here. I want to be timely with this segment so that we can get to that segment later on with Wyatt Miller of the Waterdogs beat writer. But the thing I want to get to open this thing up is the clock issues that the PLL has had so far this season, because I feel like even though it may not seem like a huge issue, especially on a week-by-week basis, I feel like it's been more noticeable maybe than what it has been in years past, perhaps. And I remember back to Week 1, they had the issues where they said it was a technical issue on the field more so than a human error thing that they were going through. I guess if I remember correctly, back to Week 1, they said that there was a power outage, I thought they said, prior to the start of play on that first day of the PLL season. And so that was kind of messing with the shot clock and kind of syncing things up and whatever the case may have been. So I remember that they had said multiple times that day on ESPN, they said that was more of a technical issue than it was more so human error. But I feel like, again, even going to the side of the human error thing, I feel like they've had a few instances already in these first couple weekends of the season where things like the shot clock have really come into play. I mean, we talked about it after Week 2, the situation with the Redwoods and the Chaos, where head coach Nat St. Laurent thought there should have been the reset there. The officials came together. Everybody somehow was in agreement that none of them saw it go off of Austin Coutts' forehead and out of play, which again should have been a reset for them. And I think that you could categorize that under human error. And there's been times throughout games where you can hear the coaches on the sideline asking, why was it reset to, let's say, 52 versus 32 and things like that. And even that situation in particular popped up in the, unfortunately for Nat St. Laurent, it popped up in their game this weekend too. They had a situation where they were playing the Atlas, and for whatever reason, on a shot clock reset, which should have gone to 32, they set it to 52. So he had a gripe with Matty Palem, the head official, about, why was it reset to 52 when it should have been 32? Why did we not stop play? And kind of what the situation was almost the previous week with Matty Palem, is he was basically saying, like, why did we not, halt play and get it corrected right then and there, and then kind of get the restart whistle and kind of play from there. And while I understand Palem's answer to that, and I get it from a kind of an in the moment thing in the way that they chose to officiate in that instance, I also kind of think that it kind of makes an interesting discussion of, which way was maybe the right way to do it, or maybe the more correct way of doing it, where they should have, as Nat St. Laurent said, should have stopped play and corrected it right then and there, put it back to 32, and then let's get this thing rolling again, which, having worked several college games over the last few years since the implementation of shot clock, even in college, like, that is something that they'll do. They'll go back, and I've run shot clock for a lot of those games, especially on the men's side, is they'll actually stop and go back and say, this is where we need the clock at. They'll wait till you get it set to that point, and then we just kind of go on from there. So I do get Nat St. Laurent's questioning of why that wasn't the way they decided to go ahead and play that scenario. But again, I also see it from Matty Palem's side of things, where he said, look, we kept it within that time frame of that 32 seconds, right? We knew the number that we were looking for in that situation, and as long as the play occurred within that set amount of time, in this case it was that 32 seconds, as long as the play, whether it was a goal or whatever the case may have been, whether, once that possession was at the 20-second mark on that 52-second shot clock, then they knew that possession was now over. So it was kind of a little bit of a math problem, I guess you could say they had to do, but he said the reason why the goal stood in that instance, as the Atlas ended up scoring on that possession, he said the reason why the goal counted in that instance was because it fell within the 20-second mark of that 52-second shot clock. Therefore, even if they had set it to 32, it still would have counted even in that 32-second shot clock. So again, I kind of see it from both sides. I've seen it done, as I mentioned, where they kind of stop play, they go back, they make sure the clock is correct, and then we just kind of move along from there. But I also see it from Matty Palem's perspective, where he said, hey, we were keeping it on the field, right? We knew what we were looking for in that situation, and the play as it played out fell within that time frame, so we saw no issue with just rolling with it as is. But again, the thing that I wanted to do with this episode, I wanted to get that PLL shot clock thing kind of out of the way to open things up. But what I really wanted to get to with this episode was the Waterdogs' need for a faceoff. You heard Scotty Royster in the opening to the show, that audio that he posted on his Twitter account after the games on Sunday afternoon. Also, shout out to him for allowing me to borrow that audio as well. But I think if it wasn't apparent after week one in their game against the Archers, because, Coach Tierney said after week one, look, we ran with it the way that we did at the face-off, and we still did just enough to be able to have a chance in the very end to try and tie or take the lead in this game. So I don't think it's really as big of an issue as people may want to make it. But I think after week 3, having seen it 2 more times this weekend and seeing just how much of a detriment it was to the Waterdogs this weekend. You saw Zach Tucci do what he did against them on Saturday. Also, shout out Zach Tucci. As Shaquille O'Neal once said, I was not familiar with your game, so shout out to him for that performance on Saturday. And then it got arguably worse in their game on Sunday against the Whipsnakes and Joe Nardella, as he had a perfect day against them at the stripe. So really, like I said, if it wasn't apparent after that week 1 game against the Archers, they made it pretty apparent after the 2 games this weekend that there needs to be an adjustment made at the faceoff, and they need to find a way to be able to roster a true faceoff guy. Because look, we talked about it in a couple episodes ago prior to week 1 that the Waterdogs do have a very stacked midfield, and that's not just exclusive to offensive midfield, but it's defensive midfield as well. And we saw several of their defensive mids this weekend. Charlie Hayes was active on Sunday afternoon for their game on Sunday as well. So I get it. They have a super stacked midfield, but a lot of teams in this league have super stacked midfields, like the Atlas being one of them, and they still have Trevor Baptiste there, right? The Whipsnakes have Nardella, the Outlaws have Weirman, right? The list goes on, and yet the Waterdogs are sitting here saying we just can't find a way to realistically be able to do it and still maintain the the balance, I guess you could say, at the midfield when literally the other, 7 teams in the league have somehow found a way to be able to do it and be relatively successful at it. So I just don't think that after this weekend in those 2 games that we just saw, from the face-off against the Waterdogs, those 2 performances that we saw, I don't know how you can still defend the decision to not bring a face-off guy in, and whether that's Stathakis or whoever, there's got to be guys in the player pool somewhere that they can bring in and be able to at least give them something at the face-off, because obviously I'm a huge supporter of Charlie Hayes, the Waterdogs defensive midfielder. We're both Detroit Mercy guys, so I'm going to support him wherever he goes, whether it's as a coach, as a player. Also, shout out Charlie Hayes getting promoted to head coach at Detroit Mercy last week as well. So big week for him getting that promotion and then being activated this weekend in the PLL. But again, I'm a huge fan of his, obviously, but I can tell you right now that is not the answer for them at the faceoff, as I saw them put him out there. They used their defensive mids a couple times on faceoffs on Sunday against Nardella, and I'm telling you right now that that's not going to be the answer going forward. So they do, I think, sooner rather than later need to roster a faceoff guy. And again, that's something that coming up in segment 2 in just a minute, I'd like to ask Wyatt Miller about and get his thoughts on that and a few other things as well. But before we get to that, last thing I want to get to here in segment 1 is my fantasy team absolutely failed me this past weekend. I want to start with the positives. The positives were Jeff Teat and Josh Byrne combining for 129 fantasy points at attack for me. Plus, I also went with Nardella at the face-off, got me 46.8 fantasy points, thanks to, as mentioned, thanks to the Waterdogs on Sunday. But in the ways that my team failed me this weekend, Ryan Drenner and Trey Leclerc combined for 1 point. Yes, you heard that right, 1 point in my midfield. And then I went with Kaut as my goalie, not expecting Blaze to be quite ready just yet to return to the starting lineup. I was horribly mistaken with that decision. So between my 2 midfielders and my goalie, I got exactly 1 total point this weekend in PLL fantasy. But again, the positives were Teat and Byrne got me 129 combined, and then you throw in the almost 47 points by Joe Nardella. So all things considered, could have been better, but I guess could have been worse as well. So coming up in segment 2, as promised, we will get to that interview with PLL Waterdogs beat writer Wyatt Miller on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back in Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, segment 2 of the show, recapping week 3 in the PLL. As promised before the break, I'm joined now here in segment 2 by Philadelphia Waterdogs beat writer for the PLL, Wyatt Miller. Wyatt, thanks for taking a few minutes with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, man. Really appreciate it.
So, first question that I want to get into with you kind of focuses more on the offensive side of things. Back after the conclusion of training camp, you wrote an article specifically highlighting the Waterdogs offensive midfield and just the depth that they had there. Now that they're a couple games into the regular season, what's been kind of your assessment of the midfield unit so far for the Waterdogs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, honestly, the injuries have not helped. Obviously, you don't have Jack Hanna and Mikey Schlosser, 2 of those really important guys to that group. When you're talking about both leadership and creativity and shot creating, I think Hanna's one of the best at that in the entire league. And, it's been a little underwhelming, the production that they've showed without those 2 guys, to be honest with you. I mean, Sowers and McArdle have accounted for nearly 40% of the Waterdogs' goals this season. And so, obviously, it's early. There's only 3 games under their belt, but I've been a little surprised that guys like Jake Caraway and guys like Connor Kelly haven't been as involved as they could have been. I think Kelly's had some good games, but his 2-point prowess is really what makes his game so dangerous. And I feel like there's definite room for improvement across the board with that midfield just being more aggressive and getting more engaged early on in games so that they can kind of get in a flow and kind of carry the team at times when Sowers and McArdle are draped by those long poles. So I really think that the midfield, obviously, it's one of the most talented units in the league, but it's been a little underwhelming so far this season, just to see how their production hasn't really matched what it has in previous years or what the attack unit's doing, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember even after you posted that article just a couple of weeks ago now, I did go back and ask you about the defensive midfield as well and maybe how they factored into a lot of the decisions that Coach Tierney had to make there. So I thought that was a really good discussion with that. Even used that article in the episode that I did leading into week 1 for the PLL with that. So now kind of taking a look on the other side of the field with the defense, it seemed like for maybe the first 2.5 quarters of week 1, they kind of struggled. They fell behind pretty deep against the Archers, but it seems like ever since that point, I think I marked it around about the 8-minute mark of the third quarter of that game. It really seems like they've kind of gotten back to form, gotten back to what we're used to seeing with the Waterdogs defense. So just kind of your, your take on the Waterdogs defense so far as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. I think the defense, it's been interesting because, like you said, they struggled early on in that Archers game, and then they kind of settled in. And although last game was a little bit high scoring, I think that people don't really realize how good the Waterdogs defense was in settled sets. I think, 5 of the Whipsnakes goals came on fast breaks in transition, and that is obviously a problem in and of itself. But I think the settled defense is something that is really kind of gonna carry this Waterdogs team far when the season goes on, especially because, they have experience and they have a lot of talent on that side of the ball. I think Ben Randall specifically has been fantastic to start the year. He took that Asher Nolting matchup in stride. He really kind of embraced the physicality of that matchup. And even though Matt Rambo, got the best of him at the end there, I really think that he did a great job throughout that game, kind of matching that energy in that matchup. And just, he's not trying to beat people at their own game. He's really kind of taking those matchups in stride. And I feel like he's, Copeland used to say all the time that he, is probably the most underrated defensive player in the league. He's just really understated guy, but he does so much for that defense. And I think Tierney really appreciates that and understands the value of him as well. And so I think he's done a fantastic job. I think the short sticks, obviously, they have a lot of depth there. I think Jake Richard has been really impressive, and I've really enjoyed watching him play. Charlie Hayes did pretty well in his first action this past week. I thought that he made a difference. And, it's interesting. The Marcus Hudgens even, I think that he had a fantastic pro debut and that he was really solid this weekend. And again, you might not know it just based on the stat sheet, but I think that the settled defense really is something that's going to carry this Waterdogs team if they can continue to be aggressive and have those slides and have success on those checks. And, it's not like you have Jack Rowlett and Jared Newman and those big name guys, but they really do play as a team. And when Tierney took the job, a lot of what I was asking him is, why did you want the Waterdogs specifically, and what made them stand out as a team that you think you would enjoy coaching? And, he's a defensive mind. He's one of the greatest defensive minds of this generation and maybe of all time. And so he really thought that the Waterdogs' camaraderie and their ability to play together and trust each other was something that he could build on. And I think that we've seen that kind of play out in the first couple weeks of the season. And even though the results haven't necessarily gone their way, I think that, again, the stat sheet might not necessarily show how impactful their togetherness has been on the defensive side of the ball. And I think if they can figure out the transition and the face-off, post-face-off defense, then I think that it'll really come together and that this team can be what they have been for the last couple of years.
Absolutely. Talking with Philadelphia Waterdogs beat writer Wyatt Miller here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, recapping week 3 of PLL action from Philadelphia this past weekend. So we've talked about the offense to start out the discussion. We talked about the defense there, the last question. I feel like we have to get into the conversation about the face-off, or maybe the lack thereof, for the Waterdogs so far this season. It's been a pretty hot topic across social media for the lacrosse community. So definitely with you being here on the show, got to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And hot topic is almost an understatement at this point. I think it's pretty much been the talk of the Twitter lacrosse community. So we definitely, I think the Waterdogs are you know, they're kind of feeling out this strategy, and I think that Coach Tierney, he really believes that the 32-second clock does put a lot of pressure on the offense. He's stated that multiple times, and he's also stated that he believes in that strategy still, and that they do a lot of work with stats and analysis, and like apart from the faceoff, and they want to win the ground ball battle apart from the faceoff, and I think that they've done a pretty solid job with that. But at the end of the day, this league is so competitive and so just over the top with talent that those possessions at the end of games are infinitely important, and they are so significant to the outcome. And yes, obviously you have to get to that point where those games are within striking distance at the end, and the Waterdogs happen to have 2 overtime games, and not having the ball on the first possession of overtime has cost them in both. Because obviously Zach Tucci with the game winner, he just goes straight to goal, and that was pretty rough to watch, almost poetic, having him get the last laugh after he was on the Waterdogs last year. And it's an interesting conundrum that they've put themselves in with no long poles being allowed at the strike. Because I think the difference between a guy like Eli Gobricht, who had the ability to just kind of throw checks and to cause chaos with that long pole, and just kind of be the guy there and not have offensive acumen, because obviously he's a defender. It was a lot more feasible to have that be successful and have him still be who he is in that defense than have Zach Currier go toe-to-toe with some of the best face-off guys in the world and still have offensive prowess at the end of the day. And, you saw it in that last game, him not taking face-offs. He was the best offensive player on the field in that game. He was running the offense, he was getting people open, he was drawing slides, he was fishing really tough shots, and that's who Zach Currier is. He is a weapon. He is the Swiss Army knife, so to speak. And everybody knows how valuable he is to the team. And something that I've been thinking about a lot is, at what point is having him face off, muting one of your best players? And, so the argument being, okay, well, we don't want to dress another face-off guy because then we're going to have to take somebody else off the roster. Well, obviously that guy wouldn't be Currier. So if you're taking Currier out of the offense, so to speak, then how much is it really saving to not have a face-off guy? Because if you were to take somebody else out of that midfield, obviously it's a really talented midfield like we talked about who has so much to offer, but Zach Currier is never going to be the one on the outside looking in. So at what point is that trade-off just not really worth it? And I think that's kind of what Tierney and the staff is feeling out right now. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure who they would take off that roster in Minneapolis if they do choose to go that route, because like I talked about in the preseason, it's just so stacked with talent. And Tierney did say at the end of that last game that that Jack Hanna and Chris Sabia could be back for Minneapolis. So when you throw Jack Hanna in there, their history and his prowess just creating off the dodge, which is something the Waterdogs have struggled with early on, you got to figure out who you're taking off. And the face-off is going to be something to talk about for the entire season and beyond. But at the end of the day, I'm not confident that Tierney's going to make a change in this next week. If I were to have to guess, then I'd say that they would once again go with the same strategy, but not have Currier take most of the draws. I think that after last game, I think it became so obvious that Currier's impact on offense isn't worth negating for some face-off wins if you can have the defensive midfielders do that for you. And so with all that in mind, I think obviously can't predict the future. Tierney is definitely the authority here, and whatever he does is going to end up being what happens on the field. But I think based on everything that's happened, I would be surprised if he made that change next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that it could kind of boil down to at the end of the day is maybe he just has to get used to answering that question every post game, maybe from, now till the end of the season kind of thing. If like you said, if that is the way that they end up doing it. So like I said, I guess he'll just have to get used to answering that question, or maybe come to expect it kind of week in and week out. And who knows, maybe he'll kind of become a pro at answering it by season's end. But Wyatt, thanks a lot for taking a few minutes of your time with us. This was really good in-depth discussion on the Waterdogs, and maybe we'll get you back on by the end of the season.
Absolutely, man. Anytime. Really appreciate you having me on, and looking forward to seeing how the Dogs do this upcoming weekend and see how this strategy plays out the rest of the year.
Yep, that was Philadelphia Waterdogs beat writer Wyatt Miller, and this has been Taking the Field with Stevie Mack.